They say a small village can tolerate almost anything except being patronised by an outsider. Hello, fellow armchair detectives. Oliver Finch here, welcoming you to Highland Mystery. A television star comes to Lochs to sell a story of hardship only to find a tragedy no editor could ever soften. If you are ready to see what the storm uncovers, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And while you are at it, drop a comment telling us where you are and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us step into the rain. Chapter 1. A camera in the rain. The wind swept down from the mountains and off the loch, carrying a sharp drizzle that rattled the hanging wooden sign of the Red Lion. It was the sort of biting Highland weather that usually drove the residents of Lochs indoors to seek the warmth of a good fire and a hot drink. Today, however, the waterfront was busy. A television crew had arrived. Action. A tired voice called out. Rory Kestrel, the famous television survival host, strode down the wet pavement. He wore an immaculate, expensive weatherproof jacket that had clearly never seen actual weather. He pointed a finger at the camera lens. Here we are in the remote Highlands, Rory declared. His voice was loud enough to startle a seagull off the seawall. Embracing the simple life. Surviving the harsh elements. Far from the comforts of the modern world. No flat whites here, my friends. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood near the doorway of the pub, his hands deep in the pockets of his uniform coat. He watched the performance with mild disbelief. His hazel eyes took in the expensive cameras and the shivering crew members. The man is a fool, Nessie Curry stated. She stood just outside Patel's general store, a tartan headscarf tied firmly under her chin. A complete fool, her sister Jessie echoed, nodding vigorously. Did you hear him complaining at the hotel? Nessie asked the small crowd gathering in the damp. He told Mr. Halberton Smythe the mattresses were too firm and he demanded artisan bread for his breakfast. Can you imagine? Artisan bread, Jessie murmured in horror. Hamish suppressed a sigh. The village could tolerate a great deal, but they did not like being patronised. He personally thought a fresh morning roll from the Patel shop was vastly superior to any fancy city bread, especially when paired with strong tea and a quiet morning. But the television people seemed determined to find fault with everything that was not dramatic enough for their screens. The cameraman backed up toward the pub entrance, trying to keep Rory in the frame. Watch out for the dog, Hamish warned softly. The cameraman stopped just in time. Lugs lay sprawled like an old hearthrug across the threshold of the Red Lion. The large dog opened one strange blue eye, let out a deep breath, and refused to move a single inch. Rory stopped his march and looked down at the dog. A smug smile spread across his handsome, tanned face. Look at this creature, Rory said to the camera. Content with absolutely nothing. Just existing in the mud and the rain. We could learn a lot from such simple, uncomplicated survival. Hamish felt a prickle of genuine irritation. Lugs was lazy, certainly, but he was not simple. He simply knew better than to stand out in the freezing rain when a dry doorstep was available. Right, cut there, the director called out. Let us get the shot by the peat stack. We need you looking as though you have been working. The crew moved down the street toward a small Croft yard, where a neat stack of winter fuel was piled against a stone wall. Rory jogged over to the pile. He picked up 2 blocks of dried peat, rubbed a bit of dirt on his forehead for effect, and posed for the lens. Hamish walked over slowly to ensure the crew did not damage the Crofters' property. As he stood nearby, his gaze fell on Rory Kestrel's expensive hiking boots. Stuck in the deep seam of the right boot was a thick smear of pale grey ash. Hamish tilted his head. It was not ordinary wood ash. The pale dust caught the weak afternoon light, showing tiny, glittering flecks. It was a very specific type of peat ash, the kind that came from the deep bogs up on the moor, not the sort you would find lying about on the village street. Rory tossed the peat blocks carelessly back onto the pile when the camera stopped rolling. 2 blocks tumbled down into the mud. Hamish stepped forward and quietly stacked the blocks back in their proper place. The television host was seeking a story of hardship in Lochs, But Hamish had a distinct feeling the man was already wading into more trouble than he could ever broadcast. Chapter 2. The Croft Where the Wind Talks. The kitchen of the Macbeth Croft smelled deeply of damp wool and burning peat. Outside, the wind whipped across the open moor, rattling the window frames and shrieking down the chimney. An old radio on the Welsh dresser muttered grim weather warnings about sleet and blocked single-track roads. Mrs. Macbeth set a large plate of warm, dense fruitcake on the scrubbed wooden table. Beside it sat a heavy brown teapot that brewed tea strong enough to strip paint. This was proper Highland comfort, a stark contrast to the pale, watery infusions the television crew had demanded earlier at the hotel. Rory Kestrel ignored the cake entirely. He paced the worn linoleum floor, gesturing wildly with his hands. "It has to be the bothy," Rory insisted, his voice cutting through the howl of the storm. "We need a dramatic overnight segment. I will do a bothy survival shot up on the moor. It shows authenticity. It shows man against nature." Old Mr. Macbeth scowled from his armchair by the glowing peat fire. He did not like this loud man, but the television company was paying a handsome fee, and sheep prices were terrible this year. Hamish stood quietly by the door, his uniform damp from the short walk up the muddy track. He had come to ensure the crew did not get themselves killed in the worsening weather. Before he could speak, a woman stepped out from the narrow hallway of the Croft. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back neatly. It was Aileen Grant, the television production manager. Hamish felt the breath leave his lungs. He had not seen Aileen since they were teenagers, back when she possessed the terrifying power to make him feel 15, foolish, and painfully awkward. "Hamish?" she asked, her professional mask slipping into genuine surprise. "Hamish Macbeth? I did not know you were the policeman here." "Aye, Aileen," Hamish managed, his voice tightening. "It is my beat." Mrs. Macbeth, whose ears were as sharp as her carving knives, immediately noticed the exchange. The village gossip network was always hungry, and bad weather only gave people more time to talk. "Oh, do you know our Hamish, Miss Grant?" Mrs. Macbeth asked innocently. She poured a cup of dark tea. "I am sure Miss Halberton Smythe, over at Tommel Castle, will be interested to hear he has old friends visiting. How is Priscilla these days, Hamish? We hear you two are hardly speaking." The air around Hamish grew uncomfortably heavy. He hated when the village discussed his private life as if it were public entertainment. "Priscilla is very well, thank you," he muttered. He reached for a thick slice of fruitcake, simply to give his hands something to do. A sudden scratching sound drew his attention to the window. Sonsie, his wildcat, sat on the stone sill outside. Her fierce yellow eyes glared through the wet glass, surveying the crowded, noisy kitchen with absolute disdain. She looked completely untamed, a creature born of the storm. Deciding that humans and their messes were a waste of time, she slipped away into the freezing dark. Aileen quickly steered the conversation back to the business of television. "The bothy on the upper grazing land is perfect for the shot," she told the Macbeths. "It has the right rugged look for Rory." Hamish frowned, setting his cake down. "The weather is turning nasty, Aileen. That old peat bothy is freezing, and the chimney barely draws properly." "It is exactly what the sponsors want," Aileen said smoothly. Then her tone shifted, becoming just a fraction too casual. "By the way, Mr. Macbeth, who has the spare key for the bothy door? We will need to secure the expensive equipment inside once Rory is settled." "It hangs on a rusty nail in the tractor shed," the old man grunted. "Anyone can grab it." Hamish watched Aileen carefully note the location of the key. The wind outside seemed to raise its voice, battering the thick stone walls. The storm was sealing the moor like a tight lid, and Hamish could not shake the terrible feeling that something much colder than the weather had just entered the room. Chapter 3. Night without singing. Dawn broke over Lochdew, not with daylight, but with a creeping, bruised gloom that filtered through thick sleet. The moor was entirely fogged over. The single-track road leading up to the Macfie Croft was half blocked by blown pine branches. The storm had sealed the village and the upper grazing lands under a heavy, grey lid, trapping everyone with their own secrets. Hamish Macbeth navigated his Land Rover as far as the terrain permitted. He parked near the edge of the lower field and began the steep walk toward the old Peat bothy. He had left Lugs back at the police station. The dog had taken one look at the sleet, sighed heavily, and sprawled like an old hearthrug by the kitchen stove, refusing to move. The air on the moor was bitter. It smelled of wet heather and the sharp, metallic chill of the frozen loch below. When Hamish reached the small stone bothy, the silence was absolute. There were no cameras, no directors shouting for action, and no loud complaints about the lack of modern comforts. The heavy wooden door was firmly shut. Hamish pushed the door open. The interior was dim, but it took only a moment for his eyes to adjust. Rory Kestrel was dead. There was no blood, no dramatic sign of a struggle, and no gore. There was only a grim stillness. It struck Hamish as an awful wrongness to see a man who was so vibrantly alive for applause just yesterday reduced to an unmoving shape on a rough wooden cot. The air inside the small stone hut stung Hamish's eyes. It smelled sharply of thick peat smoke that had never properly drawn up the chimney. Hamish stepped back outside into the sleet to clear his lungs. His keen hazel eyes scanned the exterior of the bothy. He looked at the heavy iron door latch. There, smeared against the cold metal, was a faint dusting of pale ash. It looked as if someone had handled the latch with dirty fingers and then wiped it away, but a moment too late. He stepped back and looked up at the low turf roof. The exterior chimney vent, a simple metal flap designed to keep out nesting birds and winter snow, had been wedged firmly shut from the outside. It took 2 hours for the official machinery of the Strathbane police force to groan into motion and battle its way up the blocked roads. By the time Chief Inspector Blair arrived, the Lochdu gossip network was already operating at maximum efficiency. Hamish knew for a fact that Nessie Curry was currently standing by the counter in Patel's general store, broadcasting the news of the television star's demise to anyone buying a morning paper. Blair heaved his large frame out of his unmarked car. He was sweating heavily despite the freezing temperature. He stood in the sleet, puffing furiously on a cigarette, barking orders as if he could bully the weather into obedience. "Dragged me away from my breakfast," Blair roared, glaring at Hamish. "I had a perfectly good bacon roll waiting at the canteen." Hamish mentally shuddered. The Strathbane police canteen served terrible greasy food that sat in the stomach like lead. He would much rather have one of Angela Brodie's heavy, misshapen scones with a cup of good tea than anything from Blair's domain. "It is a tragedy, sir," Hamish said quietly. "It is a stupid accident," Blair snapped. He flicked his cigarette stub into the wet heather. "City idiot comes up here, tries to play survivor, and does not know how to light a fire properly. Asphyxiation. Case closed." "The chimney vent was wedged shut from the outside, Chief Inspector," Hamish pointed out. His soft Highland lilt carried clearly over the wind, and there is pale peat ash on the outside latch. Blair stopped. His florid face lost a fraction of its aggressive colour as the reality of the situation penetrated his thick skull. A celebrity dying by accident was a nuisance. A celebrity being murdered was a massive, highly scrutinised publicity risk. "Right," Blair growled, his small eyes narrowing. "Nobody leaves this village. Not the crew, not the locals. We are going to solve this fast, Macbeth, before the press gets hold of it." Hamish looked back toward the village, hidden by the sweeping fog. The storm had locked them all in together, and the lies were only just beginning to take root. Chapter 4. Blair's Boots on the Hearthrug. The telephone in the Lochdu police station shrilled with an angry, demanding tone. Hamish Macbeth picked up the receiver and immediately held it an inch away from his ear. Chief Inspector Blair was shouting from the Strathbane police canteen. The background noise was a depressing clatter of cheap plates and scraped chairs. Hamish could clearly hear the wet, smacking sounds of Blair chewing a greasy, rubbery sausage. The Strathbane canteen served food that was a crime in itself. heavy with stale oil and utter despair. It was a stark contrast to the good, honest cooking Hamish preferred. "Listen to me, Macbeth," Blair barked down the line. "I want this entire mess wrapped up before lunchtime tomorrow." "It is a murder investigation, sir," Hamish replied mildly. "These things take time." "It is a public relations disaster," Blair corrected him loudly. "Some Highland idiot probably forgot to clean the bothy chimney. It was a stupid accident." "The exterior vent was wedged shut, Chief Inspector," Hamish pointed out softly. "And I found a smear of pale peat ash on the outside door latch. Someone locked him in." Blair swore violently. "Then some local idiot played a stupid prank that went wrong. Find a local. Arrest him. I will not have the national press swarming all over my patch looking for a scandal. Do you hear me, Macbeth? I will come down there and solve it myself if I have to." The line went dead. The abrupt click sounded like a threat. Hamish replaced the receiver and sighed deeply. The thought of Blair stomping around Lochs, planting his muddy boots on their quiet hearthrug, was enough to ruin anyone's day. Hamish left the station and climbed into his police Land Rover. The storm had passed its violent peak, but the weather remained dismal. He drove back up the winding single-track road toward the Macfee Croft. The sleet had finally eased into a thin, needling rain. Thick mist clung stubbornly to the wet heather, rolling down the sides of the hills like pale smoke. The sharp, earthy scent of burning peat fought against the bitter wind. The Highlands possessed a rugged beauty, but today the landscape felt terribly bleak and unforgiving. Mrs. Macfee welcomed him into her warm, brightly lit kitchen. The stone floor was spotless, and the fire blazed cheerfully. She immediately placed a steaming bowl of rich venison stew and a thick slice of homemade crusty bread on the scrubbed wooden table. Hamish ate with genuine gratitude. The thick, dark gravy and tender meat warmed him from the inside out. It was proper food, a wonderful comfort that sharpened his thinking and washed away the grim memory of Blair's canteen noises. Lugs had followed Hamish inside. The large dog sat firmly beside Hamish's chair. He rested his heavy chin on Hamish's knee, staring at the bowl and begging shamelessly with large, sorrowful blue eyes. He looked as if he had not eaten in a month. "Do not feed that lazy animal from the table," Mrs. Macfee scolded gently, wiping her hands on her apron. "He is fat enough already." Before Hamish could discreetly drop a piece of bread, a sudden blur of motion darted through the slightly open pantry window. Sonsie, the wildcat, landed silently on the edge of the kitchen table. Her fierce yellow eyes swept the room, daring anyone to interfere. She snatched a generous scrap of meat from a side plate and vanished back into the misty rain before Mrs. Macfee could even raise her wooden spoon. "That beast is an absolute menace," Mrs. Macfee muttered, shaking her head. She poured Hamish a large cup of dark, strong tea. "But I suppose she is far better than those television people. Have you heard what the Curry sisters are saying down at Patel's shop?" Hamish smiled faintly. Information travelled through Lochs' gossip network far faster than any official police radio. A secret in this village was simply a story waiting for an audience. "Tell me, Mrs. Macfee," Hamish said, taking a sip of the scalding tea, "what are Nessie and Jessie broadcasting today?" Nessie Curry heard it directly from the cameraman, the older woman said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "It was in the general store buying cigarettes and complaining loudly to anyone who would listen. And my own boy heard them shouting in the yard yesterday. Mr. Kestrel was blackmailing his own crew." Hamish stopped eating. He set his spoon down carefully. "Blackmailing them? About what?" "Money and lies," she nodded firmly. "Rory Kestrel threatened to go live on the internet and expose the whole show. He was going to tell everyone that the production company was faking all those dramatic survival incidents." Hamish frowned, piecing the puzzle together. "They were staging accidents?" "Aye. Staging accidents to claim huge insurance payouts and force their sponsors to hand over more money. Millions of pounds were involved," my boy heard him say. Mr. Kestrel wanted a bigger share of the profits, or he was going to ruin them all. Hamish stared thoughtfully into his tea. The pale, glittering peat ash on the door latch made a terrible kind of sense now. The motive for the murder was not a simple village grudge about grazing rights or noise. A massive financial scandal was at stake, along with professional ruin. Blair desperately wanted a neat, local scapegoat to close the case quickly. But Hamish knew the killer was someone who had far more to lose than a few Highland sheep. The television crew had brought a very modern, very greedy kind of evil into the quiet hills, and Hamish was determined to dig it out. Chapter 5. The Past Flame and the Present Mess. The heavy sleet finally surrendered to a thin, needling rain. The wind swept across the moor, carrying the sharp scent of wet heather and damp earth. Hamish stepped out of the warm Croft kitchen and into the grey afternoon. He left Lugs behind. The large dog was happily asleep on the braided rug near the fire. Lugs knew perfectly well that police work outside in the rain was a foolish human endeavour. Down in the village, the gossip network was undoubtedly running at full speed. Nessie Curry had surely broadcast the news of the murder to every customer in the shop. By now, Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, was likely planning a stern Sunday sermon on the lethal evils of television and modern vanity. Information in Lochs always moved faster than the weather. Hamish pulled his uniform collar up and walked across the muddy yard. The television crew huddled under the open back doors of their large white transit van. They looked thoroughly miserable. A nervous cameraman poured hot water from a plastic flask into paper cups. The sharp, acrid smell of cheap instant coffee drifted on the damp air. It was a tragic substitute for the strong, honest tea Hamish had just enjoyed. The city crew seemed perfectly willing to suffer terrible food and bitter drinks, entirely ignorant of the simple comforts a Highland kitchen could provide. Hamish approached them slowly. He kept his hands in his pockets, and his voice exceptionally mild. He spoke to the cameraman first. The young man shivered constantly. He kept looking over his shoulder toward the hills. He claimed he had spent the entire night down in the village, sleeping soundly in a local bed and breakfast. The production publicist stepped forward next. He was a sleek man, wearing a spotless, waterproof jacket that cost more than Hamish earned in a month. He was far too smooth. He spoke rapidly about brand damage, sponsor fallout, and press statements. He seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that his famous colleague was currently lying dead in a freezing stone hut. Then Aileen Grant stepped out of the van. She looked perfectly composed. Her dark hair was neatly secured against the wind. When she spoke about Rory Kestrel, her sympathetic words sounded perfectly pitched, but they were a fraction too quick. It was as if she had rehearsed her grief. "It is a terrible tragedy, Hamish," Aileen said smoothly. "Rory was a difficult man, but he did not deserve an accident like this." "I did not say it was an accident, Aileen," Hamish replied softly. A tiny flicker of tension crossed her intelligent face before she masked it with a professional nod. Hamish felt a cold ache in his chest. The miserable, wet weather always made people cling to the nearest lie for warmth, and Aileen was wrapping herself in several. As she turned to hand a clipboard to the publicist, Hamish looked past her into the back of the van. The floor was covered in ribbed black rubber. Near the wheel arch, slightly obscured by a coil of thick black cable, was a small, pale smudge. Hamish leaned closer. It was a faint dusting of pale peat ash. It caught the weak daylight, revealing tiny, glittering flecks. It was the exact same ash he had seen smeared on the heavy iron latch of the bothy door. Hamish straightened up slowly. The crew had firmly insisted that their heavy van never left the lower Croft yard. They claimed the vehicle could not handle the steep, muddy track leading up to the bothy. If that were true, the pale ash had absolutely no business being inside the van. Someone had walked up to the bothy, handled the latch, and carried the glittering dust back down on their boots or clothing. Before Hamish could ask about the ash, a powerful engine roared up the lane. Chief Inspector Blair slammed his car door and marched straight into the muddy yard. He did not look at the television crew. Instead, he locked his small, aggressive eyes on Robbie McPhee, the Crofter's teenage grandson. The boy was carrying a heavy bucket of sheep feed toward the barn. Blair intercepted the teenager and shoved him roughly against the stone wall. "You did it, did you not?" Blair bellowed. His face was a dark, angry purple. "You shut that chimney vent!" Playing a stupid Highland joke on the city man. Confess it now, you little idiot, and save us all the trouble. Robbie shrank back against the rough stone, terrified and completely speechless. The bucket of feed slipped from his hands and spilled into the mud. Hamish moved instantly. He stepped directly between the heavy chief inspector and the frightened boy. The soft, gentle Highland lilt vanished completely from his voice. When he spoke, his tone was sibilant, quiet, and sharp as a razor. "Step away from the lad, Chief Inspector," Hamish said. It was not a request. It was entirely final. Blair stopped shouting. He looked at Hamish, momentarily shocked by the sheer steel in the local policeman's eyes. "Do not interfere, Macbeth," Blair growled, but he took half a step back. "The boy was in the village hall playing the fiddle until midnight," Hamish stated calmly. "Half the village saw him. He has nothing to tell you about the moor." Hamish turned to the pale teenager. "Go inside, Robbie. Your grandmother needs you." The boy scrambled away into the house. Hamish turned back to face Blair and the watching television crew. The storm had trapped them all together, but Hamish knew exactly who he was protecting. He would not let Blair throw a local boy to the wolves simply to tidy up a messy scandal. Chapter 6. The Unofficial Favour. The queue inside Patel's general store was unusually long for a Tuesday morning. The air inside the small shop was warm and smelled pleasantly of fresh newspaper print, strong tea, and carbolic soap. Outside, the mist clung to the dark waters of the loch like wet wool, and the damp cold drove everyone indoors to seek comfort and conversation. Mr. Patel stood behind the counter, quietly ringing up tins of soup and packets of biscuits. He maintained a polite, neutral expression. He knew better than to interfere when the village gossip network was operating at full capacity. Nessie Curry stood near the display of local jams, clutching a plastic shopping basket. Her sister Jessie stood firmly at her side. "I saw them with my own eyes," Nessie announced to the shop at large. "Standing by the stone wall near the Croft. Hamish Macbeth and that television woman, whispering together like conspirators." "Like conspirators," Jessie echoed, nodding vigorously. "And now she is hiding up at the Macfie place?" Nessie continued, her voice rising with dramatic flair, bringing trouble to Lochs. "A homewrecker, that is what she is, leading our policeman astray when he ought to be doing his job." Hamish was not in the shop to hear the accusation, but he felt the heavy weight of the village's collective judgment as he walked down the waterfront. The sky was a flat, bruised grey. The sharp wind blowing off the water carried the bitter chill of the recent storm. He pulled his uniform collar up against the cold. He had made a quiet, unofficial move the previous afternoon, and it was already unravelling terribly. He had pulled Aileen aside in the Croft yard and asked her to stay near the kitchen hearth. He had intended to protect her. He knew Chief Inspector Blair would bellow and bully anyone in his path, and he knew the village would eagerly dissect the presence of his former girlfriend. Hamish had thought that keeping her isolated at the Croft would shield her from both the police and the prying eyes of the locals. Instead, someone had seen them speaking in hushed tones. The village had eagerly consumed the sighting and manufactured a fierce scandal. The consequences of his kindness were swift and severe. Word had reached Tommel Castle Hotel. Mr. Halberton Smythe, who despised any hint of unseemly behaviour near his luxury establishment, had immediately telephoned the Macfie Croft. Young Morag Macfie, who relied on her weekend wages from serving afternoon tea to wealthy tourists, was told not to return to work. The hotel, Mr. Halberton Smythe had reportedly said, simply did not need that sort of publicity. The entire Macfie family was now being quietly shunned. Neighbours, who usually stopped to offer a lift or share a greeting, now looked away when the Crofters passed. A small place like Lochs could punish its own without ever raising a hand. Feeling thoroughly miserable, Hamish turned away from the waterfront and walked up the short hill toward Dr. Brodie's house. He needed moral support, and the Brodies were the quiet, ethical anchors of the community. Angela Brodie opened the door. Her grey hair was slightly untidy, and she wore a large apron covered in a fine dusting of flour. "Come in, Hamish," Angela said briskly. "You look as though you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. Sit down in the kitchen. I have just taken a batch of scones out of the oven." Hamish sat at the scrubbed wooden table. The kitchen was warm and smelled faintly of burning. Angela placed a large, misshapen scone on a plate in front of him, along with a thick layer of butter and a cup of extremely strong tea. Angela Brodie was a deeply compassionate woman, but she was canonically a terrible cook. Hamish took a bite of the scone. It was hard as a rock and tasted heavily of raw baking soda. Still, it was offered with genuine kindness, and Hamish chewed it dutifully. It was certainly better than the greasy, stomach-churning sausages Blair eagerly consumed at the Strathbane police canteen. "The village is talking, Angela," Hamish said quietly, washing the heavy pastry down with hot tea. "I only told Aileen to stay at the Croft, to keep her out of Blair's way. Now everyone thinks I am hiding a criminal, and the Macfee lass has lost her job. People enjoy a scandal when the weather is bad," Angela said gently, pouring herself a cup of tea. "It gives them something to do. But you must fix it, Hamish. You cannot let the Macfees suffer for your good intentions." Before Hamish could agree, the kitchen door swung open with a violent crash. Chief Inspector Blair stood in the doorway. He was sweating heavily, and a damp cigarette hung from his lower lip. He glared at Hamish with small, triumphant eyes. "There you are, Macbeth," Blair roared, ignoring Angela Brodie entirely. "I have just had a very interesting conversation with the minister's wife. She tells me you ordered that television manager to hide up at the farm." "I suggested she stay out of the wet, sir," Hamish said mildly, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "You hid a suspect!" Blair shouted, taking a step into the warm kitchen. "You obstructed a murder investigation to protect an old flame. I will have your badge for this, Macbeth. In fact, I will do worse. I will officially recommend you for an immediate promotion and a transfer to Strathbane. You can rot at a desk outside my office." Hamish felt a cold knot form in his stomach. A promotion to the grim, concrete reality of Strathbane was his private nightmare. He loved Lochdew, with all its faults, gossip, and wild beauty. He could not leave the loch and the hills. "Miss Grant is not a suspect, Chief Inspector," Hamish said softly. "She has an alibi for the time of the murder, provided by the rest of her crew." "They are all lying," Blair sneered. "And you gave them the perfect cover to get their stories straight. I'm going to the hotel right now to interrogate the lot of them, and you will stay out of my way." Blair turned and stomped out of the house, leaving a trail of muddy water and the sour smell of stale smoke behind him. Hamish thanked Angela for the tea and left a few minutes later. He walked back to the police station. When he opened the door, he found Lugs sprawled like an old hearth rug beside the unlit stove, snoring heavily. Sonsie sat on the windowsill, her yellow eyes fixed on Hamish with a fierce, unblinking stare. She looked as though she found human mistakes entirely pathetic. Hamish sat down at his desk. He realized with a sinking heart that his attempt to be kind had handed the killer a massive advantage. He had inadvertently created a smokescreen of gossip. When he had tried to question a few locals earlier about the television crew's movements, the villagers had clammed up tightly. No one wanted to be seen talking to him, for fear of becoming the next target of Nessie Curry's sharp tongue. The truth was buried under a thick layer of rumour, and Hamish knew he had to dig it out before Blair destroyed the village completely. Chapter 7. Ash where it shouldn't be. Tommel Castle Hotel stood as a massive stone bastion of luxury against the rugged Highland landscape. Inside the main lounge, the air was thick with artificial heat, the scent of expensive floor wax, and the quiet murmur of privileged guests. Outside, the weather refused to be ignored. A bitter wind whipped off the dark waters of the loch, hurling sharp sheets of freezing rain against the heavy glass of the tall windows. Money always pretended it was entirely above the weather, but the Highlands fiercely disagreed. The television crew had retreated to this expensive sanctuary to wait out the storm and the police investigation. Hamish Macbeth followed them. He needed to keep a close eye on the suspects and maintain some control over the situation before Chief Inspector Blair completely destroyed the village's fragile peace. Hamish stood near the edge of the lounge, feeling entirely out of place in his damp police uniform. He had left Lugs in the hotel's rear entrance porch. The large dog had taken one look at the pristine, thick tartan carpets, sighed deeply, and sprawled out like a sleepy hearthrug on the hard stone floor of the mudroom. Lugs possessed a remarkable talent for avoiding unnecessary effort, and walking on plush carpets clearly fell into that category. A waiter in a crisp white shirt offered Hamish a silver tray, bearing delicate porcelain cups and microscopic sandwiches. Hamish took one politely. It was a fussy little triangle of white bread containing a single transparent slice of cucumber. It tasted of absolutely nothing. Hamish washed it down with a sip of pale, fragrant Earl Grey tea. He privately longed for a massive, irregular lump of Angela Brodie's terrible baking or a bowl of Mrs. McPhee's rich venison stew. He needed a mug of strong, dark tea that could strip rust from a tractor, not this perfumed water. "It is a total financial disaster," a loud, sharp voice complained from the centre of the room. A new arrival stood by the roaring log fire. He was a sponsor representative from London named Mr. Sterling, a man with an aggressively red face and a very tight collar. He had braved the sleet and the blocked roads solely to assess the commercial damage. "The brand is completely ruined," Mr. Sterling barked at the sleek publicist and Aileen Grant. "Rory Kestrel was the face of rugged survival. Now he is dead in a dirty stone hut, and the local press are already calling it a murder. Our investors are threatening to pull millions of pounds in funding today." Aileen stood very straight, her expression carefully neutral. "We are handling the press, Mr. Sterling. The police are investigating. We must remain calm." Chief Inspector Blair chose that exact moment to strut into the lounge. He had clearly been smoking outside in the freezing damp, as he carried the sour, heavy smell of stale tobacco with him, ruining the delicate scent of the room. He puffed out his large chest, desperate to look authoritative and impressive in front of the wealthy guests and the powerful television executives. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. "Do not worry yourself, sir," Blair said loudly, marching right up to the sponsor. "The Strathbane police have the matter firmly in hand. It is a simple local dispute. Highland tempers running hot over grazing rights or some such nonsense. We are nearly done here. I expect to make a formal arrest by morning." Mr. Sterling looked slightly mollified, but Hamish felt a fresh wave of despair. Blair was openly bluffing for his audience, clearly aiming to pin the crime on the nearest convenient crofter just to make the wealthy sponsor happy. Hamish quietly stepped away from the group. He could not bear to listen to Blair's loud boasting. He decided to check the perimeter of the hotel to see if the crew had brought any of their equipment inside. As Hamish walked toward the narrow corridor leading to the kitchens, a young hotel maid stopped him. It was Fiona, a cousin of the McPhee girl who had unfairly lost her job the previous day. "Is it true what Nessie Curry is saying down at the general store, Hamish?" Fiona whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder to ensure the hotel manager was not listening. "Did you really catch that television woman trying to burn the murder weapon in the Croft fire?" Hamish closed his eyes for a brief second. The Lochs gossip network was truly a terrifying machine. It had already twisted his simple request for Aileen to stay indoors into a dramatic, completely fictitious tale of arson and destroyed evidence. "No, Fiona, it is not true in the slightest," Hamish said gently. "Please tell your family not to believe everything they hear from the Curry sisters." Fiona nodded quickly and hurried away, holding a stack of fresh towels. Hamish continued down the quiet corridor. He stopped near the heavy oak door that opened onto the back service stairs. This was a discreet route, used primarily by the staff, and occasionally by guests who wished to slip in and out without passing through the main lobby. He looked out the small, square window beside the door. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw a flash of wild movement in the dripping rhododendron bushes. It was Sonsie. Her fierce, untamed yellow eyes glared at the imposing stone walls of the hotel for a single second. She looked entirely disgusted by human wealth and the nonsense of luxury before she vanished back into the wet undergrowth. Hamish smiled faintly, but as he turned his attention back to the corridor, his sharp hazel eyes caught a strange anomaly on the floor. He crouched down at the base of the service stairs. Ground deeply into the edge of the expensive wool carpet runner was a distinct smudge of pale grey ash. Hamish rubbed a tiny amount between his thumb and forefinger. It was incredibly fine. It was certainly not soot from the hotel's grand fireplaces, which exclusively burned dark coal and expensive seasoned oak logs. Hamish tilted his hand to catch the dim light from the elegant wall sconce above him. The pale dust contained tiny glittering flecks. It was the exact same peat ash from the Macbeth Croft. Hamish stood up slowly, the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. The television crew had adamantly claimed they had never been near the upper grazing land. Yet the same unique, glittering ash that was smeared on the deadly bothy door latch was now rubbed into the carpet of the Tommel Castle Hotel. Someone had handled that latch on the freezing moor, carried the glittering dust down the hill on their boots or clothing, and deliberately brought it into this luxurious refuge. The ash had fallen near the service stairs, a perfect place for someone trying to move through the hotel entirely unnoticed. Blair wanted a tidy, simple story with a local villain, but Hamish knew the truth was written in the pale, glittering dust. The wrong man could not possibly carry the right ash. The killer was inside the hotel, hiding behind expensive clothes and carefully rehearsed grief. Chapter 8. A tidy villain with untidy evidence. The Red Lion pub was exceptionally crowded for a Tuesday lunchtime. The heavy oak doors offered a sturdy shield against the bitter weather. Outside, a sharp wind whipped the surface of the loch into angry white peaks. Thick grey mist rolled heavily down from the hills, completely obscuring the dark pine trees and the upper grazing lands. Hamish sat quietly at a small corner table. He was eating a large, steaming plate of shepherd's pie. The minced lamb was rich and savoury, and the mashed potato crust was perfectly browned. It was a wonderful, honest comfort. It stood in stark contrast to the gelatinous, lukewarm slop Blair eagerly consumed at the Strathbane police canteen. Lugs lay completely flat beneath the table. The large dog was sprawled like an old hearthrug, entirely ignoring the loud chatter of the villagers and the smell of hot food. The Lochs gossip network was fully operational. The village was desperate for a simple story to explain the horrible murder on the moor. A neat narrative would restore their quiet lives and push the terrifying reality of the crime far away from their own front doors. Archie McLean, the local fisherman, stood near the brass rail of the bar. He spoke loudly to anyone who would listen. "It was Dougal Fraser," Archie announced with absolute confidence. Dougal had a terrible shouting match with that television fellow on Sunday afternoon. Rory Kestrel wanted to film on the common grazing land. Dougal told him to get off the grass and threatened him with a heavy stick. Nessie Curry nodded vigorously from the nearest table. She held a half-empty glass of sherry. "Dougal has a fierce, wicked temper," Nessie agreed loudly. "He probably went up to the old bothy to give the city man a fright in the dark. He locked the door and it went terribly wrong. Dougal never liked outsiders." Hamish chewed his food slowly. He listened to the eager voices. The theory was incredibly neat. Dougal Fraser was a local man with a known grievance against the television crew. He was also a solitary, grumpy figure who rarely socialized. The village was perfectly happy to offer him up as a convenient scapegoat to end the uncomfortable police presence. It was exactly the sort of tidy solution Chief Inspector Blair desperately wanted. The heavy pub doors swung open with a violent crash. Blair marched inside. He brought the sour, stale smell of damp tobacco and cheap aftershave with him. He surveyed the crowded room with small, triumphant eyes. "Macbeth," Blair barked, spotting Hamish in the corner. He stomped over to the table. "I just heard the talk outside the general store. The locals are saying this Fraser fellow argued with the victim over land rights." "He did, sir," Hamish admitted softly. He set his fork down on the plate. "Excellent," Blair said. His florid face beamed with sudden, sweaty relief. "It is a simple local dispute. A bit of Highland sabotage that went too far. I will arrest the man this afternoon. Case closed, and the national press can finally go home." Hamish felt a strong, dangerous temptation to remain silent. Letting Blair arrest Dougal Fraser would immediately stop the vicious rumours surrounding Aileen. It would save young Morag Macbeth and her family from further social exile. The village would focus all its judgment on Dougal, leaving the innocent Crofters alone. A small place could punish its residents severely, and Hamish desperately wanted the local cruelty to end. But Hamish was an honest policeman. He could not build his peace on a foundation of lies. "I will go and speak to Dougal first, Chief Inspector," Hamish said. He pushed his empty plate away and stood up. "I need to gather the preliminary facts before we make a formal move." Blair waved a dismissive, meaty hand. "Do it quickly, Macbeth. I want him sitting in a holding cell in Strathbane by 3 o'clock. Hamish left the warm pub and climbed into his police vehicle. The rain had started again. It was a cold, miserable drizzle that coated the windshield in a thick grey film. He drove slowly along the muddy coastal track to Dougal Fraser's small, isolated cottage. Dougal opened his front door after several loud knocks. He looked extremely wary. He was a large, heavily built man wearing a frayed wool sweater. "I have nothing to say to the police," Dougal grumbled, blocking the doorway with his wide shoulders. "I just need to ask a few routine questions, Dougal," Hamish said mildly. He stepped forward, gently but firmly forcing his way into the tiny, damp hallway. The cottage was freezing. It smelled of wet dog and old cooking grease. Hamish glanced into the small, cluttered sitting room. The stone hearth was completely unlit and swept totally bare. A battered metal bucket sat beside the fireplace. It was filled with old ash, ready to be discarded outside. Hamish walked over and looked closely into the metal bucket. The tidy village theory collapsed in a single instant. Dougal Fraser did not burn peat from the moor. He burned cheap coal briquettes purchased from a supplier in Strathbane. The ash in the bucket was dark, heavy, and extremely gritty. It looked like crushed black sand. It possessed absolutely no glittering flecks. The unique, pale peat ash found on Rory Kestrel's expensive boot, smeared on the bothy door latch, and ground deeply into the Tommel Castle Hotel carpet, came strictly from the Macfee peat stack. Dougal Fraser had not been near the Macfee property. He had no reason to go there, and he certainly had no reason to carry their specific fuel. The wrong man simply could not carry the right ash. "What are you looking at my fireplace for?" Dougal demanded angrily. He stepped into the room, his fists clenched tight. "Nothing at all, Dougal." Hamish sighed softly. He turned away from the hearth. "I was just admiring the old stonework. I will leave you in peace now." Hamish walked out of the cold cottage and climbed back into his Land Rover. He sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, listening to the rain drum against the metal roof. He felt a deep, heavy sense of dread. The pub crowd had warmed rapidly to the absolute certainty of a local culprit, but the quiet facts chilled that comfort completely. Dougal was entirely innocent. The real killer was still hiding safely among the wealthy guests and the arrogant television crew at the luxury hotel. Hamish had to find a way to trap them, and he had to do it quickly, before Blair destroyed an innocent man's life just to secure a neat headline. Chapter Neo, Sonsie's Glittering Gift. Hamish Macbeth returned to his police cottage as the afternoon light faded into a bruised, stormy purple. The small stone building was damp and completely stubborn against the heat of the small stove. Outside, the wind howled down from the hills, rattling the window frames and carrying the sharp, bitter scent of the restless loch. He took off his wet uniform jacket and set a heavy cast-iron frying pan on the stove. He placed a thick, generous slab of cured ham and 2 fresh brown eggs into the hot butter. The rich, savoury smell filled the small kitchen immediately. The egg yolks were a deep, vibrant orange. It was honest, substantial food. Hamish felt a wave of pity for the television crew suffering through the fussy, tasteless, microscopic sandwiches at Tommel Castle Hotel, and an even deeper pity for anyone enduring the rubbery, grey slop at the Strathbane police canteen. Lugs lay flat on the braided rug near the stove. The large dog was perfectly still, sprawled like an old hearthrug, soaking up the heat and pointedly ignoring the miserable weather outside. Before Hamish could sit down to eat, the telephone shrilled loudly in the quiet office. He walked through the connecting door and picked up the receiver. "Have you locked him up yet?" Nessie Curry demanded instantly. Her voice crackled over the poor connection. "Locked who up, Nessie?" Hamish asked mildly. "Dougal Fraser," of course, Nessie snapped. Chief Inspector Blair was just in Patel's shop buying a packet of mints. He told everyone the case is solved and he is sending a car for Dougal. Jessie and I are locking our doors until that violent man is safely behind bars. Behind bars, Jessie echoed faintly in the background. Dougal is entirely innocent, Nessie, Hamish said firmly. Do not spread rumours that will ruin his life. He gently replaced the receiver. The Lochs gossip network was a terrifying force. Blair had carelessly fed the village its favourite meal of scandal, and now the entire community was happily convicting an innocent man before supper. Hamish had to work fast to stop the terrible momentum. He returned to the kitchen and sat down at the table. Just as he cut into the warm ham, a sharp tapping sound came from the back window. Hamish looked up. Sonsie sat on the wet stone sill. He stood up and opened the window. The wildcat leaped gracefully onto the kitchen floor, bringing a blast of freezing wind and the smell of wet heather with her. Her fierce yellow eyes glared at Hamish with utter disdain. She looked completely untamed, a creature perfectly designed for the harsh Highlands. She seemed to consider human problems entirely pathetic and exhausting. She opened her mouth and dropped something small and muddy onto the clean linoleum floor. Then, without waiting for thanks or a scrap of food, she turned and slipped back out into the violent, rainy night. Lugs opened one blue eye, sighed loudly as if the cat's dramatic entrance was entirely unnecessary, and went back to sleep. Hamish crouched down and picked up the object. It was a jagged, torn strip of dark blue fabric. Hamish rubbed the material between his fingers. It was heavy, tightly woven, and highly waterproof. It was expensive, professional crew-grade gear, completely unlike the cheap plastic Macs sold down at Patel's general store. Hamish carried the torn fabric over to the bright lamp on his desk. The dark blue material was heavily dusted with a pale grey powder. Hamish tilted the fabric under the light. The ash caught the glow of the bulb, revealing tiny, unmistakable, glittering flecks. It was the exact same peat ash from the McPhee Croft. A tiny sparkle in the ash suddenly became brighter than any police spotlight. Hamish remembered the flash of wild movement he had seen earlier in the dripping rhododendron bushes outside the service door of the Tommel Castle Hotel. Sonsie had been hunting there. She must have found the torn strip of fabric snagged on a sharp branch near the back stairs. He also remembered exactly who had been wearing a dark blue, heavy waterproof rain cape that morning. Eileen Grant. The pieces locked together in his mind with devastating clarity. Aileen had lured Rory Kestrel up to the bothy. She had wedged the chimney vent shut and locked him inside, her hands leaving a smear of the Croft's unique peat ash on the heavy iron latch. Later, desperate to confuse the timeline and the location, she had carried some of that ash into the Tommel Castle Hotel. She had deliberately ground it into the carpet near the service stairs to suggest an unknown intruder had slipped through the building, but the stormy Highland weather and the thick hotel garden had betrayed her. She had torn her expensive rain cape on the bushes while sneaking back inside, leaving a piece of glittering evidence perfectly preserved for a wildcat to find. Hamish left his half-eaten dinner on the table. He grabbed his heavy police coat and walked out into the rain. He drove the Land Rover swiftly up the dark, winding road to Tommel Castle Hotel. He bypassed the grand, illuminated front entrance and parked near the discreet kitchen delivery bays. He walked quietly to the heavy oak door that opened onto the back service stairs. He examined the thick rhododendron bushes beside the path. A large, jagged branch was broken, and a few dark blue threads clung to the rough bark. Hamish slipped inside the warm, brightly lit corridor. He moved silently past the busy kitchens and headed straight for the hotel laundry room. The air here was hot and smelled strongly of industrial detergent and damp wool. A row of heavy brass hooks lined the far wall, intended for the staff to dry their wet outdoor coats. Currently, several expensive jackets belonging to the television crew hung there, dripping onto the tiled floor. Hamish found the dark blue rain cape immediately. It was hanging near the end of the row. He lifted the bottom hem. There, near the side seam, was a fresh, jagged tear. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the muddy strip of fabric Sonsie had delivered. He laid the torn edge of the strip against the hole in the coat. The fit was absolutely perfect. Hamish lowered the coat. He felt a deep, terrible sadness mixed with cold certainty. Aileen had used her intelligence not to survive the elements, but to manufacture a cold-blooded murder to protect her career and hide a massive financial fraud. She had tried to sacrifice an arrogant man, and when that became complicated, she had been perfectly willing to let the village gossip destroy an innocent crofter to save herself. It was a very tidy, modern crime, but Aileen had underestimated the untidy nature of the Highlands. She had underestimated the stubbornness of the weather, the unique composition of the earth, and the sharp eyes of the creatures that lived there. Hamish turned away from the coats. He needed to find Chief Inspector Blair and the entire television crew. It was time to stop the rumours and present the cold, glittering truth. Chapter 10. The Village Hall, Ceilidh. The Lochs Village Hall was brightly lit and uncomfortably warm. It was the night of the community fundraiser Ceilidh, organised to help repair the recent storm damage. Outside, the violent weather had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a freezing, damp calm. A heavy frost was already settling over the dark heather and the quiet loch, but inside the wooden hall, the air buzzed with life. At the far end of the room, 2 local men were tuning their fiddles. Their scratchy notes competed with the loud hiss of a massive tea urn. The long trestle tables were heavily laden with honest Highland food. There were mountains of thick ham sandwiches, Mrs. Macphee's rich fruitcake, and delicate shortbread. Angela Brodie had contributed a large plate of her homemade scones. They sat untouched, looking remarkably like heavy geological specimens. Still, the spread was vastly superior to the microscopic, tasteless cucumber sandwiches at Tommel Castle Hotel, and it was certainly a feast compared to the greasy slop at the Strathbane police canteen. Hamish Macbeth stood near the door. He watched the room carefully. He had used the guise of community relations to request the presence of the television crew. They stood awkwardly near the tea urn, looking entirely out of place in their expensive city clothes. Aileen Grant wore her heavy blue rain cape over her shoulders. The village gossip network was operating at peak efficiency. Nessie Curry held a cup of tea and leaned conspiratorially toward Mrs. Wellington. "Chief Inspector Blair is arresting Dougal Fraser tonight," Nessie announced with total authority. "He is sending a van from Strathbane to haul him away." "Haul him away," Jessie Curry echoed faithfully, nodding her head. Lugs lay completely flat beneath the main food table. The large dog was sprawled like an old hearthrug, his eyes closed, waiting patiently for a clumsy villager to drop a piece of ham. High above, perched safely on a wooden roof rafter, sat Sonsie. The wildcat looked down at the crowded room with fierce, unblinking yellow eyes. She seemed to judge the noisy human gathering as utterly foolish. The heavy main doors swung open with a violent crash. Chief Inspector Blair marched into the hall. He brought a blast of freezing air and the sour smell of stale cigarette smoke with him. His florid face was sweating, and his small eyes darted around the room aggressively. He was clearly furious that he had not yet found Dougal Fraser at his cottage. Blair spotted the Macphee family standing near the fiddlers. He stomped straight toward them. He pointed a thick, demanding finger directly at young Morag Macphee. "You there, girl," Blair bellowed, his voice cutting through the chatter. "You know where that madman Fraser is hiding? Tell me right now, or I will have you locked up for obstructing justice." Morag shrank back, terrified by the sudden volume and the heavy threat. The entire village hall fell entirely silent. Teacups stopped mid-air. Hamish stepped forward. He moved smoothly between the heavy Chief Inspector and the frightened Croft girl. "Leave the lass alone, Chief Inspector," Hamish said. His Highland lilt was gone. His voice was incredibly quiet, sibilant, and sharp as broken glass. The absolute steel in his tone made the room hold its collective breath. Blair actually took half a step backward, genuinely startled. "Do not interfere, Macbeth," Blair growled, recovering his bluster. "I am closing this murder case tonight." "You are, sir," Hamish agreed softly. "But you are looking at the wrong people. Dougal Fraser did not kill Rory Kestrel. Dougal burns coal in his grate. His ash is heavy and black. The ash found on the moor was very different. Hamish turned to face the television crew. He looked directly at Aileen Grant. She stood very still, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. There was a very specific type of pale, glittering peat ash left at the crime scene, Hamish explained to the silent room. It only comes from the deep bogs, and locally it only comes from the Macfee Croft. I saw it 3 times. He held up a single finger. First, I saw it smeared deep in the seam of Rory Kestrel's boot, right after he kicked the Croft's peat pile for a camera shot. He held up a second finger. Second, I found that exact same glittering ash smeared on the heavy iron latch of the bothy door and later rubbed into the carpet near the back stairs of the Tommel Castle Hotel. Someone carried it there to confuse the police. Hamish reached into his uniform pocket. He pulled out the jagged, torn strip of dark blue waterproof fabric that Sonsie had delivered to his kitchen. And third, Hamish said, his voice carrying clearly over the silent crowd, I found the same glittering ash dusted all over this piece of torn cloth. It snagged on a rhododendron bush outside the hotel service door. He walked slowly toward Aileen. It is a perfect match for the fresh tear in your rain cape, Aileen. The same cape you are wearing right now. Aileen swallowed hard. This is absurd, Hamish. I was in the village all night. The crew can vouch for me. They will not vouch for you now, Hamish said gently. Because we know the motive. Rory Kestrel was blackmailing you and the production company. He was going to expose the fact that you were faking survival incidents to claim massive insurance payouts. He was going to ruin your career and bankrupt the sponsors. Mr. Sterling, the sponsor representative, turned completely purple. He stared at Aileen in absolute horror. You lured him to the bothy, Hamish continued, offering no theatrics, only cold, heavy facts. You promised him a dramatic shot. Then you wedged the chimney vent shut from the outside and locked the heavy door. Your hands left the Croft's unique ash on the latch. You tried to plant more ash at the hotel to point the blame elsewhere, but the Highland weather and the local bushes caught your coat. Aileen looked around the room. She was surrounded by the quiet, steady faces of the villagers. The same people who had eagerly gossiped about her earlier were now staring at her with cold clarity. There was nowhere to run, and there was no sophisticated city lawyer to hide behind. The sheer weight of the social pressure in the small room was crushing. He was going to destroy everything I built, Aileen whispered. Her voice was thin and hollow. Her carefully maintained professional mask simply crumbled away. He was a greedy, arrogant fool. He demanded half the money, or he would go to the press. Blair stood completely frozen for a long moment. Then, realizing the absolute certainty of the confession, he puffed out his chest and marched forward. Right, Blair barked loudly, grabbing Aileen by the arm. Aileen Grant, I am arresting you for murder. I knew it was an inside job all along. Nobody in the hall believed him, but nobody bothered to correct him. Hamish watched Blair lead the defeated woman out into the freezing night. The village hall remained silent for a long time. People looked down at their teacups and their shoes, suddenly realizing how their eager gossip and cruel rumours had almost helped a killer destroy an innocent family. Chapter 11. Warmth slowly earned. The storm finally broke on Thursday morning. The heavy, bruised clouds rolled back over the hills, leaving the waters of the loch as still and reflective as cold iron. The single-track roads reopened to traffic, and the pale blue scent of peat smoke drifted safely from the village chimneys, back where it belonged. Restoration arrived the Highland way, coming quietly, stubbornly, and usually over a strong cup of tea. Inside the Lochdu police station, however, the noise was deafening. Chief Inspector Blair stood by the desk, shouting into the telephone. He was giving an official statement to his superiors in Strathbane. He spoke loudly, entirely convinced that sheer volume created the truth. He claimed absolute credit for breaking Aileen Grant's alibi and securing the confession. Hamish Macbeth sat quietly at the kitchen table, nursing a large mug of dark, scalding tea. He had just eaten a proper, heavy bowl of porridge made with thick cream and a pinch of salt. It was an honest, substantial breakfast. It successfully washed away the lingering, depressing memories of the microscopic sandwiches at the Tommel Castle Hotel, and it fortified him against the grim prospect of ever eating at the Strathbane police canteen. Blair slammed the telephone receiver down and turned to Hamish. His heavy face was flushed with triumph and the lingering effects of stale tobacco. "A brilliant result, Macbeth," Blair barked happily. "The press are eating it up. I told the superintendent you were mildly helpful. In fact, I put your name forward for a commendation and a promotion. We might finally get you a desk job in Strathbane." A cold shudder ran down Hamish's spine. A promotion to a concrete office in the city was his ultimate private nightmare. He offered a non-committal murmur, praying desperately that police bureaucracy would lose the paperwork, as it usually did. Blair marched out of the station, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel as he climbed into his car and drove away. Hamish breathed a sigh of genuine relief. He washed his mug, put on his uniform cap, and walked down to the waterfront. The village needed repairing, and he had work to do. His first stop was a brief telephone call from the public box to the Tommel Castle Hotel. He spoke gently but very firmly to Mr. Halberton Smythe. He explained the exact nature of the tragedy and entirely cleared the Macfie family of any involvement. He ensured that young Morag Macfie would regain her weekend job serving tea, with an unspoken understanding that an apology was due. Next, he walked into Patel's general store. The village gossip network, usually a roaring engine of rumour, was unusually subdued. Nessie and Jessie Curry stood near the counter. They looked slightly uncomfortable as Hamish approached. "Good morning, ladies," Hamish said mildly. "The roads are clear at last." "It is a terrible business, Hamish," Nessie said, looking down at her shopping basket. "That poor television man. And that wicked woman deceiving us all." "Wicked woman," Jessie echoed softly. "Aye, it is terrible," Hamish agreed. He kept his Highland lilt gentle, but his hazel eyes were sharp. "It is also terrible how quickly some folks sharpened their tongues against Dougal Fraser and the Macfie family. We are a small village, Nessie. A small place can do a great deal of harm without ever raising a hand. We must be careful about joining in before we know the truth." Nessie flushed a deep, embarrassed red. She nodded briskly, paid Mr. Patel, and hurried out of the shop with her sister close behind. Hamish knew the lesson would stick. The case was already settling into village memory as a stark warning. The winter storms always passed, but the cruel things people said and did during them had a habit of lingering in the damp air. Hamish walked back up the hill to his stone cottage. The pale sun broke through the remaining mist, casting a weak but welcome light over the heather. He opened the kitchen door. The small room was wonderfully warm. Lugs lay completely flat against the braided rug, his eyes shut tight. The large dog was sprawled like a heavily satisfied hearthrug, thoroughly enjoying the peace and quiet now that the loud city policeman had departed. Up on the windowsill, bathed in a square of pale sunlight, sat Sonsie. The wildcat turned her head as Hamish entered, her fierce yellow eyes locked onto his. She did not ask for affection or food. She simply watched him with the absolute smugness of a creature who knew perfectly well that she was the one who had mattered most in the end. Hamish smiled, took off his coat, and reached for the kettle. Rory Kestrel came to the Highlands to sell a story of hardship, and he found a tragedy no editor could ever soften. Lochdew will certainly remember the bitter storm, yes, but it will remember even more how quickly people enjoyed turning their own suspicion into cheap entertainment. That pale peat ash looked like absolutely nothing at all. It was just a tiny smudge you would brush away from your coat without thinking twice. But those tiny glittering flecks became the unyielding truth that simply would not be scrubbed off, because real life always leaves traces that a polished performance can never control. There is a distinct cruelty in treating other people's lives as mere scenery for your own ambition, and there is a terrible danger in trying to save your reputation by sacrificing someone else. The smallest lies often grow sharp teeth when the weather, human fear, and stubborn pride give them enough room to breathe. Still, the kettle boils, the peat fire catches, and the village finds its rhythm once again. Dogs are snoring, wildcats are prowling, and neighbours are helping one another without making a grand speech about it. In the Highlands, true comfort returns exactly the way the weather does. It arrives quietly, stubbornly, and entirely in its own time. I have a question for you tonight. When trouble hits, do you think a community is more often ruined by deliberate malice or by ordinary folk eagerly joining in before they actually know the truth? Thank you for spending your evening with us. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, as I read every single one. We will be back soon with another misadventure, but until then, stay safe, keep the fire lit, and thank you for visiting Highland Mystery. Good night,